Hey everyone, I'm Surfbone, and today we'll be talking about the title of this video, the most OP verse you've never heard of. Now, when you read that, you would have most likely thought about either Umineko or Lovecraft, or you probably ask, what verse is this, and do they beat DC Comics? Now all those thoughts are to be expected, but now to subvert the video title, and to answer both of those questions, no. And by no, I mean there is no verse to be talked about today. And what we'll be talking about today is the concept of power-scaling Hypebeasts, Secondaries, and how they interact with the game of telephone. So without further ado, let's get into it. Before we get into the points I laid out, let me justify the misdirect of the title and how it relates. So in the introduction, I laid out the questions you may ask about that title. Now what happens if I say both of these questions were yes and no respectively? This is the focus of the video. So for the sake of illustration, let's say we found this verse that isn't Lovecraft or Umineko, i.e. not one of the two widely agreed upon strongest verses for those who are not into the debate meta. And it beats DC along with all the other OP verses that you might think of, even including Umineko and Lovecraft. So maybe verses like Elder Scrolls, Warhammer, Dark Tower, Sug's verse, any verse you might think is OP. What happens in a lot of people's minds within the community when they hear that such a thing exists is, wow, that's a really strong verse, I gotta get into it. And that response is exactly what I'd like to talk about today. To nip an inevitable response in the bud, no. Jumping into a verse solely because it's OP is not the problem in a vacuum. Emphasis on in a vacuum. Now as I said before, being a power scaling hypebeast, which is someone who gets into a verse solely because of its power scaling, which is by itself a neutral action, which is neither good nor bad. What becomes a problem is when you introduce these people that don't actually care about the verse itself and or don't actually read the verse, otherwise known as a secondary. What these people who don't care or didn't read do is that they will construct arguments that to a fan of the verse are usually nonsensical, because they are aware of the context. But to the people who just engage in ordinary discourse, it'll be seen as any normal argument. So for example, let's use Dragon Ball as an example. Someone may try to argue that Goku scales above Frieza, and Tien scales to Goku as they fought in the tournament, so Tien scales above Frieza. Now since basically all of us have consumed Dragon Ball in some manner, this argument is completely nonsensical for many reasons, such as Goku got stronger than Tien, as evident when Goku beat Piccolo and Tien couldn't, and the Frieza fight is far after the tournament. This level of absurd argumentation is made all the time for way more obscure and lengthy verses that the general population of the community has no real defense against. While, yes, to us who have watched Dragon Ball, scaling OG Tien to Frieza arc Goku is absurd, but to someone who's never really seen the show before, it becomes much trickier to spot the incongruity in the story. So for this verse that the video is pretending exists, may have any number of incongruent arguments be made by secondaries. And then what will happen is, then the people who don't even care about the verse then have to hop on the wave and perpetuate them even further. This is why I clarified that just the act of hopping on waves is not inherently bad, but it becomes bad when arguments are made without the understanding of the verse in question. To jump topics for a second, let's talk about the game you may have played in school called Telephone. One kid starts out with a message like, "The dog is blue," and it gets passed on from person to person, and at the end of the message is something like, "The sky is dog." Now you're wondering how this interacts with the core theme of the video. So to go back what was said prior to the topic of Telephone, let's say we hear about this super OP verse in a debate between a character from it and anyone from any OP verse you can think of. The argument presented from this OP verse is as incongruent and faulty, similar to the Tien argument made earlier, and because no one's read this verse and is not aware of the context, no one can defeat this argument. Now, people will hear that and say, hey, there's this new OP verse in town, and it won a debate against XYZ verse. and I'm sure you can see where this is going. What was just a report of what happened in a debate will change into, this verse is objectively more OP than any of your verses. Now within the community we have, this rumors is now spreading and mutating in people's heads. These people, mind you, also haven't consumed any of this OP verse. So they are defenseless against this thought germ, and it takes a hold in them to make this problem spread throughout the community, until it ends up reaching the ears of a prominent member, who is then basically tasked to consume the media themselves and show their own interpretation with the debunks to the previous argument, as it to which the secondaries will then latch onto, and this cycle never stops. Now, I've used this word a few times, secondaries, and you might be wondering what that term means. For transparencies, secondaries is a term borrowed from 4chan, which refers to the people who do not interact with the primary thing of interest. So essentially, if someone who's a secondary to comics, they don't read the comics, and instead only listen to someone who talks about comics. Secondaries come into this grand scheme because they don't consume the content. They won't be able to see how absurd or incongruent the argument is, and will only parrot it shamelessly and perpetuate this thought germ throughout the community, as the community itself will have its fair share of secondaries. What it ends up taking is a prominent member to influence these secondaries in the other direction. Now, secondaries will always exist, it's a fact of fandoms. However, it is not inherently a bad thing. What becomes a bad thing is when these secondaries are consumed by these thought germs. They become more like sheep than people who simply consume some form of media. So when you have a community full of these sheep who don't read anything, the meta will be at such a state where it's just rat arguments. Now, with all these concepts established, we can relate them with what's called the debate meta. To those of you who play competitive games, meta may sound familiar, and it's a very similar concept. For those of you who don't know, meta is sometimes referred to as most effective tactic available, and that is for all intents and purposes what it'll mean here. In some communities, meta means something else like a game that is beyond a game, or in this case, a metagame. So what does the most effective tactic available mean in debating? Well, it means that the arguments that are able to win winning the crucible of debates. These arguments in an ideal world would be the most consistent interpretations of events formed with a holistic view of the series. But we don't live in an ideal world. Instead, what happens, due to this problem that this video is about, is metas form around making arguments that people who don't or haven't consumed the media would have no idea how absurd or incongruent the arguments are. For example, the basis of arguments like Gwenpool's Soulless Fiction, check out my video on that by the way, is effectively hoping that you haven't read enough Marvel or are aware of wider concepts within the Powerscaling interest to debunk it. In comparison to arguments like the story of Superman, which is founded in the source material and goes on to make the source material more consistent than if you were to reject the interpretation. To get back to the root, what happens is that due to the verses with large amount of content existing and the amount of secondaries the community will have, it is not healthy for the debate meta or the community at large to spread around misinformed and dishonest arguments. Even though you might know why the arguments are bad and wrong, that doesn't make it okay, as similar things will happen with verses you aren't aware of. Now, if you're someone who is niche and is reading the Boo Saga every week, or if you hang out in 90 different scaling communities just to hear the meta from every angle, then the next part of the video is for you. So what should you do? Well, to be real with you guys, trying to find a good answer to that question somewhat stumped me and Hashi when writing the script for this video. Because ultimately, this video won't really solve or get rid of the problem. So at that point, it comes down to what I hope to do with my videos here on YouTube. To not only educate people on concepts that they may not fully understand, but also try and teach people to self-reflect. And what I mean by that is, having a serious look at yourself and realize that you are a part of a larger community. And to piss in the proverbial ball pit is not something you should do if you want other people to hop in the pit. In conclusion, these factors all blended together form this problem with the community that becomes a hassle for anyone to realistically put down. As the bigger the verse is, the less likely it is for anyone to have read absolutely all of it, allowing these germs to spread further. But until the next video, thank you all for watching, and class is dismissed.